1 second while I set it up. We are now live.
All right, good morning, everyone. This is the December 6th hearing of the Joint Audits and Evaluations Committee. We welcome members of the committee, as well as the Office of Legislative Audits and representatives from the Maryland Department of Labor. We have a busy agenda, mostly focused on the Department of Labor and Division of Unemployment Insurance. And I know we have presentations and representatives from the department coming up as well. I want to turn it over to my co-chair, Delegate Mark Chang, to see if he has any opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for being on this committee hearing this morning. And thank you to the Office of Legislative Audits for their extensive work that they'll be presenting today. And also thank you very much to Secretary Robinson and her staff and the Department of Labor for being here this morning. We'll look forward to the presentation and questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Chairman Chang. First on the agenda, we have the audits from the Maryland Department of Labor Division of Unemployment Insurance, Unemployment Insurance Tax Contributions. This is part one, and the Office of Legislative Audits will explain why this was divided into two parts. And to begin with that, I will turn it over to the director, Mr. Greg Hook. Mr. Hook, I think you're muted.
We don't want that. We don't want that. Thank you. Good morning, co-chairs and members of the committee. As always, it's a pleasure to be here. And for the record, I am Greg Hook, the legislative auditor. Today, we have 5 presentations of varying length and complexity. The first 2 are audit reports, for which I will make some brief introductory comments before turning it over to the audit staff to present the detailed findings. The next 3 presentations are fairly standard calendar year-end updates. One will highlight some aspects of OLA's fraud investigation and data analytics units. The next presentation is on repeat audit findings, a topic that came up during the November JAEC hearing. And finally, a brief summary of audit reports issued during the month of November 2022. Both fiscal compliance audit reports to be presented today are the Maryland Department of Labor Division of Unemployment Insurance, or DUI, an agency that rose to great significance during the COVID pandemic. Historically, OLA used to issue one audit report on DUI, but as described in the 2 current audit reports, OLA divided the recent audit work into separate parts. Specifically, DUI administers the state's unemployment insurance program that includes 2 primary responsibilities. The first is collecting unemployment insurance tax contributions from employers, and the second is processing applications for and dispersing unemployment benefits. In addition to the COVID impact on DUI that greatly increased unemployment insurance activity and required the expansion and modification of various DUI operations, DUI finalized the implementation of its new information system, Beacon, which further impacted its operations. As a result, and to provide necessary audit resources and coverage, we have divided our audit report of DUI into the following 2 audit parts to better align and address the aforementioned responsibilities. Part 1 is on unemployment insurance tax contributions, and this includes employer unemployment contributions, reimbursements from government agencies and certain nonprofit organizations, associated accounts receivable activity, and related changes from a recent system implementation. The Part 2 audit report is on unemployment benefits. This includes methods individuals can use to file for unemployment insurance benefits, eligibility and monetary benefit determinations for state unemployment insurance, and for additional programs in response to the COVID pandemic, payment monitoring, prevention of fraudulent claims, and related changes from a recent system implementation. I need to emphasize that although COVID materially affected DUI operations, our reports still include determinations of DUI statutory compliance or the necessity of controls over operations. We are going to make 2 distinct presentations on Part 1 and Part 2 to give each appropriate coverage during this hearing. I will add at this point that DUI generally agreed with our findings and recommendations. The first report presented is our May 4th, 2022 fiscal compliance report of DUI Part 1, Unemployment Insurance Tax Contributions. This audit report included 6 report findings spread among 4 different areas of operation, with 3 under the employer contributions area. Based on our division of work between the 2 separate reports, or 2 separate audits, we followed up on 2 of the 6 findings from the prior DUI audit report and found that both were resolved by DUI. We found 3 issues related to the absence of controls over employer contributions, including the failure to reconcile accounts that contributed to large dollar differences in recorded activity, no verification and unemployment tax collections were appropriately deposited since September 2020, and a lack of regular data matches to ensure that Maryland employers registered with DUI as required by state law. We also noted a lack of aggressiveness in pursuing delinquent accounts of employers who have not contributed sufficient funds. One final topic I need to address is finding 6. Although it is included in our public report, we are not going to highlight this finding in our verbal remarks for part 1. Rather, we will discuss it with the other cybersecurity findings for part 2. I might add that this audit report was made available on our website on May 9th, and the emergency cybersecurity legislation, which requires redaction of such findings from our public audit reports, was not signed by the governor and effective until May 12th. Hence the reason this cybersecurity finding was in the public report. With that, I will turn it over to Mike Merdzak, who's our audit manager, Lauren Franchet, our audit senior, and Paul Denz, assistant audit director, to give you a presentation on DUI part 1. And I believe you have a handout and a copy of the audit report available. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to present today. For the record, I'm Michael Merdzak, and I served as the audit manager for this audit cycle of the Division of Unemployment Insurance, which I'm going to call DUI for the remainder of this presentation. Greg mentioned that DUI is a division of the Maryland Department of Labor, and to coincide with the divided audit reports, I'll be making 2 separate presentations, one for each report. First, I'll cover the Part 1 report, which Greg mentioned was issued in May of this year. Moving to page 2 of the presentation is a report overview, and it's shown in bold font. To administer the unemployment insurance program, the agency needs to collect funds in advance from employers, referred to as unemployment insurance tax. How Maryland unemployment insurance taxes work is that employers are required to remit periodic payments based on wages paid to their employees. And this has been static since 2016 at a percentage range for the first $8,500 of employee wages, but has increased in calendar year 21, now ranging from 2.2 to 13.5%. And just to provide some perspective on the scale of operations, DUI collected from employers just over $700 million, including $637 million in taxes from employers in FY21, but also received $7.6 billion in federal funding, mostly due to the pandemic. The focus of a Part 1 report resulted in, this was the focus of a Part 1 report that resulted in 6 findings, none of which were repeats. Page 3 of the presentation is a summary of key findings from the report provided for convenience. However, I'm going to move right to page 4, which is for background information on the system implementation. A large-scale project went underway, which started actually in 2011, which was to replace separate DUI systems into a consolidated system, which is referred to as Beacon. This project was a modernization initiative of the Federal Department of Labor and was originally planned as a consortium of 3 states, although the other states withdrew. The project was primarily federally funded, and Beacon was implemented in its current format in September of 2020 after numerous delays. There are 3 paragraphs included at page 8 of the audit report detailing this project. At page 5,
Mr. Chairman, can I quickly interrupt? And I'm seeing it in the chat. Very difficult to understand what we're hearing. I see other members chiming in saying they can't hear it either. Is there something that can be done to improve the audio before we continue?
Yeah, Mr. Mirzak, is it possible to be closer to the mic? It's the audio is a little bit kind of intermittent.
Does that sound any better?
Mike, do you want to grab your stuff and run up to my office?
Sure.
So if you don't mind, I'll have Mike. Mike's about 30 yards away. I'll have Mike come up here and sit in my chair because I think my audio good.
Yours sounds
Yeah,
very
yours is
good.
great.
Thank you.
Okay,
And
we'll
this was a problem at the last hearing we had. It was the exact same scenario. Yeah, it would be most appreciated if we could actually hear the words. Thank
no
you.
problem at all. Mike's on his way and should be here in a second. Then I will give up the command chair temporarily to Mike. And there he is. All right, Mike. Feel free.
Apologies for that. Should I restart explaining taxes or anything, or just pick up from where I left off?
I think you can pick up from where you left off.
Okay,
Thank you. You sound a lot better.
thank you. Three, four. Okay, so left off on Beacon. In that it was implemented in September of 2020 after delays. And if you need any more information on that, please refer to page 8 of the audit report. Moving to page 5 is our first issue, detailing the absence of controls over employer contributions. Specifically, the failure to reconcile accounts that had contributed to large dollar differences in recorded activity between funds received and the postings to employer accounts, ranging from monthly differences ranging from $640,000 to $21 million for the 6 months we reviewed during a 24-month period. If you're interested, figure 4 on page 11 of the audit report details the actual months and differences and shows that this condition existed prior to and continued after the pandemic became a factor. Page 6 of the presentation details another absence of controls for verifications of the deposits that had not occurred since September of 2020. This occurred because Beacon was not able to generate accurate reports of activity. And this finding takes on greater significance when you consider that deposits for fiscal year 2020 by the bank totaled $460 million. Page 7 of the presentation is for finding 3 and details a lapse in conducting data matches to ensure that Maryland employers are registered with DUI as required by state law. And registration is needed for contributions to be paid. Although DUI was able to conduct such matches on a weekly basis prior to September of 2020, only 5 matches were conducted the year following. However, no follow-up was conducted for these 5 matches, which means there's a lack of assurance that all tax revenues owed are collected. Additionally, the propriety and completeness of employers being registered is unknown. On page 8 of the presentation, we detail reimbursable employers, which are employers, mostly government agencies and nonprofits, that are allowed to reimburse DUI for unemployment insurance benefits paid to their former employees. Election of this option does require collateral to protect the state from failure of their employer to reimburse. From our inquiries, we found that records were not available from Beacon to indicate how many of these employers exist and how much collateral they require to have. However, based on records existing prior to Beacon, it appears collateral exceeded $100 million. Moving to the next finding, where Greg had mentioned in his open remarks a lack of aggressiveness in pursuing delinquent employer accounts. This is detailed by finding 5 and highlights a lack of formal policy on the collection process and also points out associated impact. Of importance is that there is no involvement for DUI by the State Central Collection Unit, or CCU, which increases the importance of collection efforts by DUI. Additionally, for an entire year after the September 2020 implementation of Beacon, no payment requests have been sent by DUI to employers. Furthermore, write-offs, which is the elimination of a record of debt, were not reviewed after July of 2017. And finally, Beacon was unable to generate accurate reports of amounts owed. The next slide, as Greg mentioned, refers to finding 6, we'll be covering in the closed session. And the final slide is conclusions for your convenience. At this time, I'd like to open for questions related to the Part 1 report.
Questions from the committee members? Feel free to raise your physical hand or raise your virtual hand. I had a question for Mr. Merzak while we're waiting to see if there are any other questions. The Beacon system, as you mentioned, was a consortium that was a contract that was first entered back in 2011. When was the intended implementation date for Beacon?
I believe the original implementation date was 2018.
So years before the pandemic.
Correct. Trying to find the agency probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was 2018 was the original plan implementation date. Yes.
And
yes,
and the system didn't go live until, was it September of 20, you said September of 2020? In the middle of the pandemic. Okay. And was there federal funding to help support the rollout of Beacon?
Yeah, the project was primarily federally funded, like almost entirely federally funded. Again, because it was the Federal Department of Labor provided states the option of replacing their systems, and they were providing the funding to do so if a state elected to try to modernize its prior systems.
Did the federal government have to then provide a waiver or an exception for us to have such late implementation because there was delay?
I am aware of several requests for extension on implementation date. I can't speak to exactly how many extensions there were. I think the agency could answer that question for you in greater detail.
So your understanding is that this system was supposed to be in place and completed by 2018 per the federal government, and our state and the department had to request several exceptions, which pushed this back to September 2020 in the middle of the pandemic.
That is my understanding, yes.
And do you have any sense, and this may be a question for the department then, within the contract that we entered into with Beacon, are there provisions for failure to deliver, or similar to some of the things that we looked at with Optum, were there provisions in place to be able to hold the vendor accountable?
I'll definitely let the agency respond to what provisions specifically exist in the contract related to the system.
Okay, thank you. I see we have some hands up. We can begin with Delegate Arntz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on that conversation, you said it was federally funded. There's a lot of federal money. Is there any federal accountability in all these things we're going through right now, or is this just going to all be laid on the state?
I'm not sure if this addresses your question, but there was a lot of federal reporting required. Like the state had to advise Federal Department of Labor on the progress of the project.
Okay, well, once they got that, when they were advised we were running into problems, was there any federal intervention that we could have expected that should have been done? Because if you're 2 years behind on something and the federal government paid for it, don't they have some accountability to us that we're accounting to them what we're doing and we're not keeping up? Were there any stopgaps from the federal government in place that you know of?
Oh, okay. The one thing I can kind of point toward is that the actual go live date of Beacon in September 2020 was a federal mandate to say this is a no later than date to implement. So they were definitely involved, actively involved in monitoring the project and placing restrictions on how delayed the project could be.
I think for me, I'd be interested in understanding what they did to help facilitate this or what they didn't do to help facilitate this. If we were 2 years late on something, I would have expected them to have a bigger role in how we were moving forward and why we weren't moving forward to push us a little further along. That could have helped us and eliminated some of the problems we ran into once we got into this mess. But thank you very much for the answers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Delegate. Just one follow-up from that along those lines. And the that was a no later date that had been extended, right? Mr.
Correct.
Marzan?
Yes,
And the department requested those extensions.
the department did request the extension.
And there were 2 other states that entered into this initial contract with Beacon, and both of those states decided to bail out.
Correct. The other states withdrew from the project.
Okay. Senator Hester?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. It's my understanding that Beacon is actually a technology platform that sits upon the kind of the older systems that the state had. And so my question is, was the audit of Beacon itself, or did it include the entire IT system, which I believe includes Beacon plus the underlying IT systems?
The audit included all systems, previously existed and current. Now, Beacon really doesn't sit atop of pre-existing systems. It replaced. However, you did have to take the information from the old systems and transfer it into Beacon to move forward.
So at this point, are we 100%? Is all the data 100% into Beacon?
All data should be in Beacon at this point.
Fabulous. And so at one point you had mentioned that there were some missing reports or discrepancies. And so is that they're missing, like the reports simply aren't there? Or are they, or is the data like there but not on Beacon?
I think it's more so that that is in Beacon, but not, the agency has not figured out ways to functionally pull it out for review. So when we look at things, we look for output reports to say this activity occurred, and that was the restriction in our audit. A lot of findings point to that these reports could not be generated or were not accurate. However, the data is inside of Beacon. It's just they haven't found a way to format it out and extract it in a usable method.
And is that our fault or is that the vendor's fault?
I would let the agency respond to whose fault it is. But our stance is that for the system to function for the agency, there's certain functionality that needs to be accurate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hester. Next, I see Senator Eckert has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow up on that. Wouldn't that be a part of the original agreement with Beacon to be able to have deliverables and produce data? Is that a part of it, Mr. Hook?
I would agree that the original contract requires a functioning system. I'll let the agency respond to what specific deliverables were there and how maybe it deviated on what they thought they were being provided versus what the system was actually providing.
And I just have another question. It's probably more appropriate for the agency, but in the event that the deliverables or the parameters are not there for producing something, are there backup systems or alternates that you were aware of in your discovery that identified another means of extracting that data?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, it should be a standalone system, but without a backup.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Senator Eckert. Any other questions from members? Okay, seeing none. Does that wrap up the segment of the presentation from OI? Zach?
For part one, I believe we were going to allow the agency to respond to any questions related to part one before moving into the part two audit report.
Okay, so with that, we'll bring forward Secretary Robinson from the Maryland Department of Labor. You can go ahead and introduce your team.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Chairman Lamb, Chairman Chang, and members of the Joint Committee, thank you for the opportunity today to be here. For the record, I'm Tiffany Robinson, Secretary of the Maryland Department of Labor, and I have with me virtually our Deputy Secretary, Dave McGlone, and our Chief of Staff, Sarah Beardsley. I was planning to give some opening remarks and then open it to questions. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to do that now or wait until the end of both audit reports, or just answer some of the questions from the first part and then give opening remarks after. Do you have a preference?
Why don't you go ahead and give opening remarks now, and anything you might want to present, and also address any questions that you might want to address that have already come up.
Sure, happy to do that. So my opening remarks are kind of general and encompass both parts of the audit, and we will be happy to take questions after. Before I get started, I would specifically, so that I don't forget, respond to one of those Beacon questions. I want to make sure that everyone understands that the implementation timeline for Beacon had already been extended prior to the time I started as secretary in 2019. We had a funding deadline from USDOL of September 2020. We were in constant collaboration and work with USDOL because it was 100% funded by USDOL all along the way during this project from 2011 until we launched in 2020. And part of the reason for those extensions was really because of the stops and starts with our consortium members. They were also working with USDOL and really just couldn't pull it together to meet their deadlines. And once we realized that they were kind of dragging us down, we requested USDOL allow us to move forward alone. And they approved that. And so we originally had worked internally with the federal department on an implementation launch date of spring of 2020. Of course, that was before we knew the pandemic was coming. And so when that happened and we were very overwhelmed, we requested that they allow us to extend up to the deadline, which was September 2020. We actually asked for an extension to wait and do it after the pandemic. But it turns out we think it was best for our customers that we went ahead and did it in September. They denied that extension request and we launched in September of 2020. So I'm happy to take more questions at the end. I hope that answers some of that specific question. Before I get started on my just general opening remarks, I would like to take a quick opportunity to publicly acknowledge and thank the hardworking state employees of our Maryland Department of Labor, particularly those serving in this unemployment insurance division. Many are watching today, and I can tell you they have faithfully and bravely stood on the front lines of what was really an unprecedented once in a 100-year crisis, showing up every single day to serve their fellow citizens. So thank you to my staff for your hard work and your unwavering dedication. I can honestly tell you that leading the Maryland Department of Labor has been both the greatest privilege and the greatest challenge of my life, as you might imagine. And I'd like to first make very clear that the majority of recommendations contained in this audit report, both audit reports, have already been resolved. And the few reconciliations that remain are being actively worked on and will soon be complete. Those are mostly due to the large amount of data from transitioning from our old system, which exists no more, into our new modernized Beacon system. And with that said, I think we all know that the pandemic created numerous and unprecedented, unforeseen challenges for unemployment operations across the country, not just in Maryland. And what I want to tell you is that reality continues to this day. As a very quick reminder, our claim volume went from 136,000 claims in fiscal year 2019 to 1.5 million claims in fiscal year 2021, and up to 1.9 million in FY 2022. That's a 1,400% increase overall. This was just an unforeseen and historic surge in demand. And we took proactive steps to address it during the crisis. We onboarded more than 2,000 contractors. We paid existing staff overtime for months and months. We worked around the clock to provide technical assistance, resolve claim issues, and pay benefits to honest, deserving customers. We also transformed our Baltimore office headquarters ground floor into a kiosk center so that constituents without broadband could come and file in-person claims. And we reopened our 32 American Job Centers in July of 2021, and we put those UI kiosks all around the state. But arguably, as we just talked about, the largest action we took when this pandemic hit was pivoting quickly to go ahead and deploy and launch our Beacon 2.0 digital platform. This system completely modernized and integrated our benefits, tax, and appeals systems for the benefit of our customers. Beacon streamlined our UI operations. It increased data accuracy, facilitated real-time data sharing, and eliminated labor-intensive processes. And we are 100% certain, especially knowing what we know today, that our old system could never have handled this crisis. We did not want to be like other states with people standing in lines around the building with paper applications. Maryland learned, as did every other state, that the federal pandemic programs brought with them a wave of sophisticated digital fraud. And even with our upgrades and enhancements, this new battle would require massive amounts of staff time, attention, and resources. I know that all of you know a little bit about that, and I will thank you and your teams for your partnership along the way, because I know it took some of your staff time and resources as well. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the unrelenting flood of fraudulent claims has had a significant ability on significant impact on our ability to serve honest constituents. We have calculated that fraud has increased our workload on every single claim by at least 40%. To date, we have flagged nearly 1.9 million claimants and 2.5 million total claims as potentially fraudulent. In fact, we've received more fraudulent claims than honest and deserving claims. And despite our continued investments, upgrades, and new strategies, the schemes our fraud experts continue to uncover to this day are sophisticated, ever-changing, and increasingly brazen. So please let me summarize just a few of our efforts. We have partnered over the last couple of years with Maryland State Police to alert consumers on evolving threats and scams. We continue to work with multiple federal agencies on active UI fraud investigations. I've written to our congressional delegation pleading for more federal assistance in this arena. We have uncovered and stopped out-of-state fraudsters posing as your constituents, trying to get legislators to help them unlock their fraudulent claims. We developed in-house fraud detection algorithms. We introduced a document verification process, and we contracted with a well-known vendor to use their state-of-the-art identity verification services. But even with all of this anti-fraud activity, we still battle these criminals kind of under a cloud of suspicion. We were constantly under pressure from elected officials to pay everyone. The prospect of fraud was openly being dismissed as minimal. It was something that we should just settle up on after we were done paying everyone. Thankfully, the national news media began some investigative journalism, and earlier this year, the Washington Post and NBC helped to expose the staggering degree to which our nation's federal unemployment insurance system was attacked and plundered by sophisticated cyber criminals. Just yesterday, as you may have seen, NBC News informed the nation of a serious national security threat. Cyber criminals aligned with the Chinese government and experts believe still are among the many criminals attacking state unemployment insurance systems across our country. Look, we all know that hindsight is 20/20. So looking back, would I have done some things differently? Of course. Did honest and deserving customers get caught up and delayed because of all the fraud? Yes, they did. And we continue to work every single day to resolve those issues as they are presented to us. But knowing what we knew and seeing every day what was systematically happening to these ever-changing federally designed pandemic programs, a really difficult decision had to be made. Without a doubt, the easier, politically convenient thing to do would have been to pay everyone, as many demanded of me. But we chose another route, and that was to help honest and deserving claimants as quickly as was humanly possible, while also fighting and exposing what really turned out to be the largest theft in American history, and now also a significant breach of national security. So let me be very clear. If we had succumbed to the enormous political pressure to pay everyone, we would have lost tens of billions of dollars to very determined criminals. And we now know we would also have been providing critical data to our nation's most committed adversary. I have never suggested that everything we did was perfect, but instead of pointing fingers, what I really believe the people of Maryland deserve is an honest and depoliticized, bipartisan conversation about what really happened and how together state and federal officials can ensure it never happens again. I appreciate the option to address you and to answer questions. And as I mentioned earlier, we have our team on the call today, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Members, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hands, virtual or physical. I guess if you do it virtually, it'd be easier for us to see. I'll kick us off with an initial question addressing that last part that the secretary was just touching on, which was the fraud piece. You spent a lot of time talking about the fraud concern, and obviously we have concerns too, because fraudulent dollars that are going out to individuals that shouldn't be receiving them are taking away dollars that could otherwise go to those who are in need, obviously. But I guess the fraud is not isolated to our state. Obviously, this is something that had been taking place across the nation in all states that were probably experiencing similar rates of fraud across the board. And yet, when I look at, I think it was Pew Charitable Trust had an analysis done in late 2020 of benefits that were going out, comparing states across the nation. Maryland ranked third from the bottom when it came to getting payments out to applicants within the first 3 weeks, with only South Dakota and Kentucky below us. And so, I can't imagine that all the other 47 other states ahead of us were not experiencing fraud concerns as well. How do you address the fact that you cite a lot of fraud, and yet we were very slow in getting at least initially, in getting our unemployment benefits out the door?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. You're right. The USDOL reporting mechanisms are antiquated. We've had many conversations about them. I cannot answer for the way that other states report their data, but we were very honest in our reporting, including all the liberal backdating that we provided to claimants. So when a claim was filed and then we backdated it for months and weeks, which flexibility was allowed by USDOL during the pandemic and the time of this audit, that immediately made the payment on that claim look like it was later than it actually was. So that's a big part of it. I can tell you that as of right now, we have reported to USDOL, separate from the way that they might report it, that we are issuing determinations for the past many, many weeks in a row to 92% of the time within 21 days. We're really proud of that. And I will tell you, just the fraud and the backdating issue was the biggest issue that contributed to the accurate reporting that we provided to USDOL. We know that some other states reported differently and did not define all the backdating the same way that we did.
Okay, thank you. With regards to Beacon, it sounds like the system had many challenges, particularly getting up to speed initially. And it sounds like there were concerns with, at least from other states, of how Beacon was able to, provide the scope of work that they had committed to. And in part, that was why some of these other states that were part of this consortium decided to not proceed further with Beacon, leaving Maryland as the sole vendor that decided to move forward with Beacon itself. Why did the Department of Labor decide to remain with Beacon when the other states decided to turn away from this vendor?
Well, primarily because there was such a large federal investment. This was approximately a $70 million project that was 100% federally funded. And we were already many, many years in, and we had the buy-in of hundreds of state staff that were being trained and working with our vendor. I can tell you when the pandemic hit, this vendor never turned away from us, even though we might have been outside of the contracts to give them payment. USDOL issued, I lost count of the number. It's over 20 unemployment insurance program letters, which is their guidance document, consistently changing PUA, FPUC, all LWA, all the 10 federal programs that they threw out to states with very little guidance during the pandemic. So we would get our vendor working overnight. They had at least 70 people working directly on Maryland's projects during the pandemic. We would get them to program something new. And I will remind you that we were one of the very first states to launch a system for PUA. It's a bit of a catch-22. We were really proud of that, to get that opportunity to file for those benefits out to our customers. It probably, in a retrospect, invited those fraudsters to hit the first system that was available to us. But our vendor never told us that they couldn't do it. It would take time. There were multiple priorities. They would program the system one way. USDOL would send a change order and on the guidance documents and say, no, you actually can't pay people unless you have these 10 questions included. So we would have to reprogram, and they would do that for us overnight. That happened daily and weekly. And the vendor really stood by our side with all of those changes. As you may remember, the PUA program stopped and started by the federal government multiple times. The lost wages assistance program, came in under FEMA, which we have never worked with before. All of those brand new programs were stood up in a matter of days and weeks with the help of our vendor, as opposed to in normal times. I think anyone that has a background in technology and would look at the complexity of these programs and what they were doing, it would have taken months, possibly in a state agency, years. So we're proud of the work we did. We never said it was perfect, but we were trying to stick to our priorities and do what was best day by day for our customer.
So it sounds like the feds were the primary, maybe the only funder for the Beacon system, but is it accurate to say that the state was really the one overseeing and managing the contract with the vendor? We were the primary interface. The Department of Labor was the primary interface with the vendor, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And all the funding came from the U.S. Department of Labor through the Maryland Department of Labor.
So ultimately, Beacon is responsive to the Maryland Department of Labor.
Yes.
Okay. I'll have some of the other members proceed with their questions. Delegate Arntz, I saw your hand first, and followed by Senator Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for the information. Some of this stuff came as a surprise. I didn't realize some of it. But based on the federal government, you had mentioned that the federal government told you we couldn't back out at the end. Is that correct?
So that's correct. We wrote a letter. And we got our federal delegation involved, and simply because of the overwhelming nature of the surge and volume we were facing due to the pandemic, we had already stood up. Remember, we started this contract with Beacon back in 2011. So there was so much technology already in place. We felt that we were in a good position in April of 2020 to stand up the one-stop, which was really just the benefits application online filing system. It was a piece of the technology that was already planned that we were able to stand up very quickly so that our customers could file online. Our hundreds of thousands of customers that were filing weekly could file online. The entire launch for the program, which I mentioned, we had a deadline of September 2020, was intended to implement the tax, benefits, and appeals system, all integrated in one modern system, meaning there is no more support from the old antiquated legacy system. That is the piece that we wrote to USDOL, to the current secretary, and we requested an extension simply because of the overwhelming nature of the pandemic and the volume that we were receiving. They said no. It would have apparently required an act of Congress to extend the funding. the funding for the project had a deadline of September 2020. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, we moved forward. We tested and retested and worked around the clock to do everything in our power to have the entire modernized system ready to go. And I mentioned before, hindsight is 2020. Even though we asked for the extension, I'm actually glad we launched the new system because it was a benefit to our customer. And even though we had to make priorities and continue adding every single function that needed to be included in the system along the way, it was absolutely beneficial that our customer had the system launched and that we had the ability to pull that data so easily from our vendor.
Okay, based on that, did the federal government provide you with any additional assistance once they told you that? Knowing that other states had pulled out, you were told you had to move forward. Did they do anything to sit back and say, hey, we have your back?
So that might be a question for my deputy secretary, who's a CPA and who has been a CFO for the department for even before I was here. I will preface it by saying, yes, we still are in partnership with USDOL on this project, and they approve all of our maintenance of operations funding for the project going forward. There's obviously a period of performance by which they continue to fund any defects, any programming that needs to be fixed for a program. I'll kick it to my Deputy Secretary, Dave McGlone. Do you want to add anything to that answer, Dave?
Thank you, Secretary. And for the record, Dave McGlone, Deputy Secretary with Maryland Department of Labor. Delegate Arntz, it's USDOL has been very, very cooperative. Tiffany's talking about the appropriations bill that Congress passed that set up the funding for this, so that if USDOL had the power to change that, they would have, but they couldn't. It simply literally would take an act of Congress to change that. They did change it one time. They added an extra year in these projects. So we went from 2019 to 2020 with the liquidation deadlines, but that was all done by Congress. So we have gotten all the support we could from USDOL in the funding of this. They just couldn't extend it any further because that was an act of Congress. And I think Congress is looking at these things. It was a good idea at the time to combine these states, but history has shown us that trying to get multiple states to agree on things and move quickly just in many cases was a fool's errand. So, but they're looking at breaking it down into segments at this point.
I have a little bit of background in systems engineering, what have you, and it's very, very difficult to put a task on somebody during a crisis. And it seems like once this crisis was found out that we didn't really have the support of the federal government, even to the point of when fraud was discovered, and fraud was discovered rampant throughout every state, I would have expected some help. Some of this stuff comes as a little bit of a surprise to me, just because we've had a number of hearings with you all, and now we're hearing some of this stuff and the issues that were literally forced upon us as a department and forced upon us as a state. And I was just wondering, in hindsight, what are they doing to help us right now based on all the fraud we did experience? And they were kind of aware of it, I would think. Have there been any additional dollars given to the state to help clear up this fraud? Any additional dollars to help us man a system that we were moved to actually implement prior to its readiness?
I'll turn that back over to Secretary Robinson. I think she has some information on that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, Delegate Arentz, these are great questions, and I do remember talking in some previous hearings about the fact that USDOL did allow, thankfully, us to submit some additional SBRs, supplemental budget requests. Specifically, they allowed us to request funding for our vendor contract with LexisNexis for our anti-fraud activities. Along the way it worked was they would give states allowance to submit a supplemental budget request. And 9 times out of 10 during the pandemic, they would grant those requests and pay for the systems that we needed to implement.
Okay. Are they helping you with resolving the fraud? Have they given you any additional tools and any assistance to help resolve this fraud as far as the accountability of it?
So back in, I can't remember the month, that I wrote to our federal delegation asking them to help us with getting more federal assistance on fraud. I didn't get a response to that letter, but USDOL has recently, their deputy secretary just put out some information just this week that stated that even considering all the fraud and the issues that states are facing, it's interesting because our funding models, the resource justification funding model that comes from USDOL, has been reduced in 2022 by about 20% for states. The deputy secretary at USDOL argues that they need to take a look at this. We as state leaders, I can tell you, I am a part of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies, and we would have weekly meetings during the pandemic to kind of cross-reference and use best practices across the country. And this was one of the biggest issues we talked about and that we pushed for as a national association, and as states individually. We did so in Maryland as well. It was for reform of the federal funding model of unemployment insurance. It's really set up so that there is more funding in the midst of a crisis, and then when the volume reduces, that funding goes away. And there has never been a mechanism, a uniform mechanism at the federal level to handle this type of fraud. I guess I could credit them and say this was new. But for 2 years now, we've been promised by USDOL that we will have new revised guidance documents related to fraud, and we have yet to receive those. I will say that they have started a strike force. We've been in partnership with the FBI. I'm really thrilled that one of the strike force offices is here in Baltimore, and we have met with their teams. They are doing more active and aggressive prosecution, which we are in partnership. I know in President Biden in his State of the Union address addressed that they were going to more aggressively prosecute pandemic fraud, including unemployment insurance fraud. And we have partnered with them on that effort. The funding and the uniform guidance or mechanism specifically for the states to do that has not been put together yet.
That surprised me. I've received a number of emails from the federal delegation, each and every one of them, with unemployment issues that were not getting addressed during the pandemic and all that. So I'm surprised they didn't step forward. I really appreciate your answers, and I applaud you on the effort, and good luck. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doug Arntz. Next, I see Senator Kagan has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Secretary, I join you. I suspect I speak for all of us in thanking your employees, your colleagues. I know that all of us were frantically in very regular touch with them, trying to help our constituents and who were threatened with eviction and all that. So thank you. I know it was a brutal time. My question, and fraud is obviously enormous and disgusting to take advantage of other people's misfortunes. But there are people whose cases have been rejected. And I appreciate your very quick response to the constituent we have in District 17. I see Delegate Polakowicz-Carr is here. Could you just speak just generally to the concept of how the appeals process is going? My worry is that people who don't have income may feel a need to hire a lawyer and further go into debt. How simple, how user-friendly, how multilingual, and how speedy is that process just generally? And again, not trying to litigate our constituents' case right here.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Kagan. I can tell you that the Beacon system, the integration of the appeals system into the benefits and tax system, is a game changer for Maryland and for the handful of states that have done it along with us. And there were delays in all of those states, by the way, because the system is extremely complex, as I think we all learned during a pandemic when there was such a highlight on this program. The appeals process is such that we have a lower appeals board and an upper board of appeals. They operate within the department, but independently of the department. So I have administrative authority over administration of those boards, but I cannot get involved in the process of a pending appeal. So for example, without going into details of one of your specific constituents, when a claimant has filed an appeal, which they do online in the system, literally they can, if their case is at a point where there has been a denial of a determination at the UI level, it says, would you like to file an appeal? And they can click that button. It goes to the lower appeals first. Then it's in their court. We can see our team, because it's all integrated, can see notes and information and all documents that have been uploaded, which is really helpful because if someone's in the middle of an appeal, we can provide a little bit of information, but we cannot get involved, with the actual appeal until that appeal has been closed and a decision has been rendered. So at that time, the claimant either has the opportunity, if they don't like that decision, to file an appeal to the higher level board, or because that case has been closed at the lower appeals level, my team can get back involved. For example, if there's new information, if there's an uploading of a document or a card that was previously not received that we now have, our team can jump back in and make a different decision, which might be the case with one of your constituents. So we look into every single case. Every single case is different. And as you can imagine, some of these get extremely complex, especially when they go up through the appeals system. But we're really proud of how fast we are moving through. We have provided overtime pay to our lower appeals and upper appeals boards through the department to make sure that the backlog didn't move from our UI division into our appeals boards. It's taking a little bit longer than it would pre-pandemic, but we're getting through those appeals very quickly and hope to have every pandemic appeal completed before the end of the year.
Super. Thank you so much for that answer, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Senator Kagan. Next, I see Delegate Palachmich-Carr has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Robinson, for being here today. I wanted to ask about the ability for Marylanders to reach Department of Labor employees through the call center. In the audit report, there is a very illuminating graphic that shows the very high volume of calls that have been received, especially during the peak of the pandemic. And, we all certainly heard from constituents who were very frustrated and unable to get through in spite of calling hour after hour, day after day. But what I think especially concerns me is at the tail end of that graphic, which leads up to, I think, the beginning of this year in terms of the data, is that there still is an unanswered call volume, that there are still calls that people are placing where they're not getting through and connecting with someone. And I'm hoping that you or a member of your team can speak to where staffing is at and what the scope of that problem is at this point.
Thank you, Delegate Carr. So our abandoned call rate through the call center is right at around 2%. And oftentimes those percentages come from someone who might have to wait a couple minutes to get through to someone and they drop off the line before the call gets answered. I can tell you that we've handled almost a billion calls since the beginning of the year, and 21,412 calls were abandoned. So that's a small percentage, and the number of people who disconnected before we were able to answer can happen for a number of reasons. I want to kind of spin back to fraud because there's some interesting statistics on this. We are still receiving about 50% of our calls that come in. Our call center, we have all this data analytics that show us that they are flagged as primarily and mostly, we believe they are fraudulent. For the past 6 months specifically, we have polled the 25 top repeat callers. I know you all heard me talking in hearings through the pandemic about our problem with repeat callers, whether they were using a bot or clogging up lines and just calling over and over and over again. The top 25 repeat callers have called in the past 6 months over 39,000 times. And upon further investigation, over 78% of those calls were linked to fraudulent claims. So that is the problem. And it's why in my opening remarks, I wanted to make sure everyone understand fraud is an issue we are still facing even today. And it's why we still need to have a call center vendor on board to take those calls and to screen them, because the federal government pulled back their flexibility for us to allow call center vendors, even though they were highly trained, to help us with adjudication. Only a state merit staff can adjudicate a state unemployment claim. So we need those call center vendors to answer those calls, to screen for fraud. We have a number of metrics and analytics and identity verification ways that we do that now. And I can't go into details because I don't want to tip off the fraudsters, but our call center vendors do that. And then we have more recently created a direct access to our UI professionals so that when our call center gets a legitimate claim with a claimant that needs help, we can immediately warm transfer them to our UI professionals in the department that have the authority and expertise to resolve those claims very quickly.
And Mr. Chair, is it okay if I ask a follow-up question? Thank
Certainly,
you.
go ahead.
So looking ahead in terms of those call centers and staffing there, and that certainly did make a difference when those contracts were expanded. You know, a lot of economists are forecasting that we're unfortunately going to be going into another recession, likely in the next year. How flexible are those contracts in terms of staffing up in the future? Should there be the need, and should there be an increase in call volumes in the future?
It's a great question. They are fortunately extremely flexible. We have worked for so long with our call center vendor that's on board right now, which we are working to extend with the BPW even this week, that they have become truly part of our team. We have weekly and sometimes daily calls with those training managers. We have, at the height of the pandemic, been up above 2,000 vendor employees on the call center phone lines. We currently are at a much lower level, approximately 300, 350, but they have the ability with training managers and a train the trainer model, and all of our, they essentially have gone through this crisis with us. And they also, just like our Beacon vendor, they also had to be brought up to speed daily and quickly and make sure every single staff on the phone lines understood all the nuances of the federal program changes, because they were the ones advising the front lines of our clients that were calling in. So we are happy to keep that team on board at least through next year. And then we'll see what happens with an RFP, but it's important for us to keep that expertise and the team that has been working with us on board, because they can staff up and down very, very quickly.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Delegate Blackledge-Carr. Any further questions? I had a follow-up question on kind of the history of how we implemented the system. So the system, as you had mentioned, Secretary, was initiated back in 2011. And as we've kind of discussed, there were two other states, I think Vermont and West Virginia, that decided to no longer proceed with Beacon. Do you know when they decided to decline further pursuit of Beacon?
I may have to ask for Dave's help on this one. I believe Vermont dropped out much earlier, and West Virginia was a little bit more recent. I do know that in having conversations with West Virginia, when I got to the department as secretary, they, don't get me wrong, the project was federally funded. But as you might imagine, there is a ton of training that happens and integration in terms of state staff needing to create the business rules to pass along to a vendor to create a giant system like this. I know that West Virginia in particular simply didn't feel like they had the internal time and resources to make it happen by the deadline that USDOL was putting on us of 2024, the finalized project. I don't know the details of Vermont. Dave, maybe you can weigh in.
Yes, Secretary, I can. In 2015, the year the contract was awarded, that's the year that Vermont dropped out. They dropped out before we actually made the award for the contract, because I think they realized early on that they were not going to be able to keep pace with this project, given its size, and they, a small state, they didn't have the resources they felt to keep up with it. And in 2020, that's the year that West Virginia dropped out. For a similar reason, they just realized that we were getting ready to go live, and they just didn't have the staff to keep pace and weren't going to be able to do it. So they opted out. And the USDOL redirected the money from those states towards Maryland to continue the project.
So that's helpful context. So the system had been 9 years, I guess, in the making until September of 2020, when the rollout was no further extensions were allowed by the federal government for the rollout, and there was citing here of an act of Congress that would be required to be able to extend that even further. I just want to make clear that the context here is that the initial contract was entered into in 2011, 9 years before the pandemic, right?
That was the initial,
Procurement.
that was the
Procurement
initial
for this.
requirements. That was a grant for getting the requirements together. And then in 2013, we started the process of getting a contract developed, and the contract was awarded in 2015. So those were the timelines for that. And then from 2015, we tried to get a launch date of 2018, and we had a year's buffer to 2019, but then Congress extended that to 2020, and that's when we ultimately went live in 2020.
So that's helpful. So the initial go live date for the Beacon system was actually intended by a state, kind of intention to be 2018. I guess,
2018, right?
And then it was extended, and at the request of us, at the request of Maryland, right?
Exactly. We realized, and at that point, we were still working with West Virginia, that there was a lot to be done, and we were trying to get all these, because we were launching it, all three systems: the tax system, the benefit system, and the appeal system, all together in sort of a Big Bang theory, and trying to get all the testing and everything else done. Went beyond the 2018 initial plan, and then as we got into 2019, we realized we were happy that Congress got us the extra year, because we were going to wind up going into 2020 as it looked.
So there were multiple go live dates that all preceded the pandemic. And while there was a lot of citing that this would require an act of Congress, and the U.S. Department of Labor wouldn't extend this any further, our original intention was to actually launch this years before the pandemic.
That was very aggressive timeline. You're right. We were looking at 2018, but that was not going to work. So we had to come back and recalibrate.
And if I might add, Mr. Chairman, when I got here to the department in 2019, I do remember having lots of those conversations with West Virginia. They were a big roadblock for us, because the federal government as a consortium wanted us to be moving, in lockstep together. And we were outpacing them, and they were having some serious concerns. So there was so much back and forth. This modernized system was a major IT project that replaced a 30-year-old antiquated legacy system. So I would hope that there would be understanding that we did not want to launch something until it was ready, and until it was right, until we could test and make sure every single piece of this integrated system was going to work properly. We obviously could not have expected or foreseen a pandemic coming our way in the midst of, our intended launch.
And you cite the fact that you didn't want to launch something until it was ready. Do you feel that it was ready in September 2020?
I feel that it was as ready as it could have possibly been. At that point, would we have liked, because of the pandemic, would we have liked to have had a few more months of testing with that type of volume and those type of issues overwhelming us? Absolutely. We didn't get that. And so you're right, we'd been working on this for years. All the technology was in place, and we had assurances by our vendor that we were ready to go. And while we had to prioritize perfecting the programming on certain aspects of, for example, reconciliation in our system, I believe that it was worthwhile, and I would make the same decision again to launch.
Okay, so your contention is that it was as ready as it could be in September 2020. I think many of our offices and our constituents as well had seen many parts of the system that didn't seem like they were ready to roll or ready for prime time while the pandemic was still going on. And I think that was obviously concerning to many of us, and we experienced that firsthand with a lot of calls coming into our office as well. And I think you also cite the fact that the vendor has been working with you. Were there provisions in the contract that allowed for liquidated damages? Because I think many of our constituents were very anxious, were concerned. We received a lot of frantic calls from people that would not be able to make their car payments, would not be able to support their families. And so I think I have concerns about how the vendor was able to respond to the needs that you have as a department. Were there provisions in the contract to allow for the state to be made whole and our constituents as well?
So, Mr. Chairman, that's probably more of a question for our Attorney General's office. I would have to check, and I'm happy to do that and follow up with you. I do want to remind you that when we're talking about all of these years of planning and programming and design and testing, we were planning for the integration of a modernized benefits, tax, and appeal system that was based on the regular unemployment insurance program. We, at the last minute, asked our vendor outside of our contract that they had no mechanism to be paid for to program 10 additional last minute federally created pandemic programs. And they did it. They did it all for us so that our claimants could apply for those programs. Some states opted not to even enter into some of those programs, denying their citizens access to those benefits because of the complex nature of the programming that was involved. So when we're talking about launching a system in 2020, it looked completely different than the design and program launch did even just 1 year before. I do give credit to our vendor for standing by us and doing all of that work, because we were intent upon making sure that our citizens had access to every single federal benefit that was being offered. Even though it was difficult to do, and even though it may not have been perfect and we had some reconciliation to do on the back end, that it has all been done or is being finalized. And our vendor now, just like any major IT project in this year or two after launch, is perfecting everything that you find. I think those of you involved in technology know when you launch a major IT project, you typically anticipate, there's a reason we have a period of performance. There's a reason we have maintenance and operation funding from the feds to continue to fix and work through issues and nuances that we maybe would never have found in testing. Sometimes it takes the real live launch for us to identify some of those issues. So we've prioritized them from day one, and our vendor has continued to resolve every issue that we've presented to them.
Right, thank you. I have no doubt that this was very difficult to implement, and especially during a pandemic. I think what the pandemic showed was really kind of gaps in the system that we felt as legislators, oftentimes firsthand with constituents calling us, that from the view of many of our constituents, this could have been the Department of Labor's finest hour, and in some ways, to many of them, the department didn't rise quite high enough to the occasion. And for some of them, I think the service that they expected didn't meet their expectations. For others, it did. And, it's been a mixed experience for a lot of folks. But, and I still, in our office, still continue to get calls every week from folks who are still having unemployment insurance challenges. Now, we forward them and we work with the department. The department has tried to be responsive. We appreciate that. But there are still ongoing calls that we get, and probably other offices within the legislature too, that receive concerns every single week from constituents. My last question, I guess, then has to do with a point that Mr. Merzak was bringing up, and that was being able to draw data out of the system. This was specific to part one of the audit that he was summarizing. And it's a two-part question, I guess. One, there was a lot of attention obviously being paid to fraudulent benefits that were going out. But in many ways, it sounds like from part one of this audit that there were certain instances where employers were not making proper contributions into the system, right? So the benefits are coming out of the system, but it's also important to have proper contributions into the system. And those were coming from employers. And while this may not be considered formally fraud from the employer standpoint, there appeared to be employers that were not properly paying into the system. And, I'm concerned about that. And at what level have we addressed those to make sure that every employer that's supposed to be paying into the system is properly paying into the system? That's part one. Part two is with what Mr. Merzak was alluding to, that there are some parts of the Beacon system where we can't export data that we as a state really need and are looking for. Have those been addressed as well?
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take part two first. The ability to export data is streamlined and simple with our new system. We have entered into multiple MOUs. Oftentimes we are required to get approval of USDOL to share any data that is related to UI because the federal statutes say that we have to, the data can only be used for a UI purpose. However, we get approval all the time. We enter into MOUs with organizations and entities and local jurisdictions to share data. And because of, we would not be able to share any data without printing reports, and it would be a snapshot in the system only from our legacy system. But with our new system, Beacon allows us to essentially pull almost any data you could ask for at any time. So that's a really good thing. In terms of your first question, I think, was about employer payments. We are, you're right, there have been employers maybe that didn't accurately pay. And so we are going through, as part of our reconciliation, audits on all employers and on all employer accounts. That is, might have been on hold during the heat of the pandemic, but it is all following up now. And those payments are being made to ensure that that the trust fund is made completely whole and or penalties are issued. If I might add a comment to your previous comment, please remember, we don't hear from the 90% of claimants that get paid. Payment claims that come in that do not have separation issues or responses disputing the claim from their employer or do not have suspicion of fraud are oftentimes paid within 48 hours through our system. It's all electronic. So that's a really great thing. I know that claimants still contact you and still, go around us to get the attention they deserve, primarily because there is still so much fraud in our system. We aren't able to directly take every single claim and handle it, in real time. We hope to get there. It's absolutely unacceptable to our honest and deserving customers that we can't do that yet. But to say that we could have shined during a pandemic and that we did not, I would have to disagree with that. I think our own employees who were also experiencing a pandemic and transferring to remote work and we were trying to keep each other safe, and we were working around the clock on calls sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning, trying to work with our vendor and work with our employees to make sure we understood the new programs being thrown at us, to ensure that every claimant was getting the benefits they deserve, not realizing in those early days that 50% of the volume in our system was fraudulent. So we were one of the very first states to expose that. We're talking about a major complex IT system. I would argue that even Ticketmaster didn't handle a concert ticket launch very well in the past month. We are a state agency that was working under impossible circumstances, and I'm really proud of our team.
Although for Ticketmaster, it wasn't a matter of life and death for the most part, but for a lot of our constituents, this is really their ability to stay in their homes, to keep their cars, to be able to support their families. And so I think it's important to kind of have that right frame too. And I hope that you will devote as much attention to making sure that the employer contributions in the system are dealt with, as well as as much as attention that you've been giving to the fraudulent claims on the benefits end.
Absolutely. Our number one priority is our customer, and that is claimants and employers, and our fiduciary duty to our trust fund.
Okay. Any further questions? I think we have part 2, so we can turn it over to Mr. Hook and his team for part 2, unemployment benefits.
Thank you, Senator. As you can see, we haven't quite resolved the technical issues. Apparently it's with the platform that's being used. So Mike is going to be in my office, and I'll turn it off to him. Our second report is DUI Part 2, unemployment benefits, which is dated November 15th, 2022, and coincidentally was issued to the committee members smack in the middle of the November JAEC hearing. This report contains 13 findings with 3 repeat findings from the prior DUI audit report. And based on some of the questions already asked, it appears the committee has had a chance to digest this lengthy audit report, which included a significant amount of background information, much of which will not be highlighted today in our presentation. What will be highlighted are the 3 findings under the benefit payments heading, including the absence of certain critical data matches, comprehensive procedures to detect claims from foreign internet protocol addresses, and verifying that applicants who were full-time students were eligible for benefits. We will also present 5 findings under the claims processing heading, such as duplicate payments and untimely verification of income reported by certain benefit applicants. And there are also 4 cybersecurity related findings, which were redacted from the public audit report in accordance with State Government Article 2-1224I. Consequently, there are additional confidential slides in your package for findings 10 through 13 and finding 6 from part 1 that will be discussed in a closed session after the remainder of this report is presented and discussed. Finally, due to the financial significance, number, and repeat nature of certain findings, we determined that DUI's accountability and compliance level was unsatisfactory in accordance with the rating system we established in conformity with state law. This means that the findings in both reports will be subject to a formal OLA follow-up review within the next year, probably within 6 months from now. With that, I will turn it back over to DUI audit team of Mike, Lauren, and Paul. Thank you.
Sorry for a little bit of musical chairs here. If the presentation can be pulled up, previous audit, it's titled simply unemployment benefits. Really what this means for DUI is the administration of processing applications by claimants and then subsequent weekly requests by those claimants seeking their actual benefit payments. Moving into page 3 for background, which a little bit has just been covered by Secretary Robinson. And her comments were very, very fair. That the increases in activity were unprecedented. Activity shot through the roof, and that's here in bold. That payments during FY21 totaled $8.8 billion to more than 642,000 claimants. For comparison, FY19 prior to the pandemic, DUI paid roughly $433 million only to 100,000 claimants. There's a graphic for this increase in activity in the audit report as figure 1 on page 10. Additionally, on the next slide, oh no, staying here, I'm sorry, still on this slide. Big actions that I think also were spoken upon in the Q&A session was the staffing vendor that DUI staffed up, and they did so significantly. Their claim centers, they used to have about 160 people, and they put in more than 2,000 full-time equivalent staff with a contract that totaled $356 million. There's another graphic in the audit report that shows how this staffing contract was scaled up, where it originally was intended to provide 200 staff at a cost of $20 million. And then it was determined that more would be needed, and 6 change orders were undertaken to increase the staffing to sufficient levels. Similarly, DUI's adjudication staff was augmented, and adjudication is not really a familiar word, but if you want to break that down into something a little more familiar, it's those people that resolve the difficult issues, such as when an employer and an employee's claim of how much earnings were are in disagreement, and that takes some case resolution. So they've put in an additional 675 staff per the contract. This contract was approximately $71 million. Moving now to pages 4 and 5. This is just a summary of the key findings that are included in this report, but what's nice here is that the repeats are easily identified. Moving to finding 1. I know the secretary talked at length about fraud, mostly as it is today, but finding 1 is efforts to detect fraud during the audit period. And there's a lot of information in this presentation, but to simplify it, really layman's terms, DUI stopped doing activities they used to do to detect improper or fraudulent claims for a period of time during the transition from its previous systems to Beacon. And since benefit payments are issued weekly, these matches have the potential for stop loss. Basically, we're 9 historical matches that DUI would conduct, and those are included, a description of those matches is included at page 24 of the audit report. But we found that for all 9 matches that used to be conducted in the older MAB system, there were periods of time that matches were not conducted as the agency transitioned. Also critically important is that roughly for a 5-month period, DUI was processing claims via both MABs and Beacon One Stop. However, all the payments processed through Beacon One Stop were excluded from these matches, and this was over $7 billion in payments. Moving to page 7 of the presentation, which is also for finding 1, details how in the absence of DUI performing these data matches, we, with extensive assistance from our new data analytics unit, conducted 3 matches to determine the extent of questionable payments. Questionable payments included those to state employees, incarcerated individuals, and deceased individuals. I would like to point out some intentional terminology used on the presentation and the audit report, which is where we quantify individuals as named recipients, meaning that unemployment claim may be filed on behalf of an individual in a fraudulent manner due to identity theft. Finding 2 is a repeat finding for DUI's procedures to detect claims and payment requests from foreign internet protocol addresses, which can be indicative of individuals that are not eligible for benefits. This may be because they're not able and available for work, or an indicator of fraud. What our prior report included, and we continue to recommend, is DUI use this available information for proactive monitoring. One thing that has appeared to us is the DUI's position to this is that the proactive monitoring is no longer required due to improved blocking implemented with Beacon. However, as shown in the second bullet on this presentation, this blocking was not yet comprehensive at the time of our audit. Moving to finding 3, which is also a repeat finding for 2 other conditions that can affect eligibility. First, verifying applicants who are full-time students are eligible. And second, for ensuring enrollment for the Maryland Workforce Exchange, which is a mechanism for reemployment. Finding 4 is for duplicate payments, which we really have 2 different premises here. Right before the bolded duplicate benefit payment wording on the slide are the words prevent and detect, and I want to cover those in reverse order. Detect can be very, very complicated, as it can be a bad actor intentionally trying to manipulate the system, which could happen in instances of identity theft. But we stress that complication does not make action unnecessary. Prevention is really the crux of what we found at this finding, in that Beacon did not prevent duplicate findings. And the details in the first bullet show that the system would allow for numerous payments to the same individual for the same week. One caveat is due to the information available from Beacon, we could not quantify definitively that all 43 million was actual duplicate payments. So there's still investigation required here. Finding 5 is very specific to the pandemic and is one of the things Secretary Robinson was alluding to with all the new programs that were pushed upon DUI by the Federal Department of Labor. And this is specific to pandemic unemployment assistance, or PUA benefits. And PUA expanded unemployment to cover individuals that prior to the pandemic would not have been eligible. For example, those that are self-employed. Now, what was required was for these individuals to provide documentation substantiating their income. And then the documentation, once received by DUI, would require manual verification. PUA recipients receive benefits based on whatever income they entered with their application until the supporting documentation was reviewed. So untimely verifications of income reported by these applicants could result in overpayments. In our attempts to quantify the overpayments, we discovered another deficiency with Beacon, in that it did not have the capability to show the amount of income entered by the DUI employee or new supplemental staffing employee who had done the income verification. Finding 6 is another repeat finding for supervisory reviews. And this can be lumped into the category of general oversight. And in this area, we found it significantly lacking well prior and through the pandemic. Specifically, as shown, the pre-existing claims and adjudication staff we had found at one claim center had not occurred. No reviews had occurred of adjudication since December 2016, and no reviews had occurred of claim adjustments since October of 2019. Additionally, adjustments made by the more than 2,000 new full-time equivalent staff, the supplemental staff, were never subject to review. And Beacon also came into play for manual adjustments made by DUI headquarters employees where the system did not have the capability to generate output reports to show adjustments that have been entered. Accordingly, the completeness of reviews that were conducted is questionable. Page 13 of the presentation is for finding 7, which is also a repeat. And similar to last audit, we found that DUI had not established a control to ensure that reissued debit cards were proper. The uptick in activity due to COVID resulted in over 350,000 cards being reissued, compared to 90,000 reissued cards in the prior audit. Now, included in the current audit period, 350,000 reissued cards were 1,970 of very high-risk reissuances in that they were sent to addresses not included in DUI's system. Additionally, last audit, we found there was $450,000 still with the bank responsible for issuing debit cards that had expired, the cards that expired 3 years ago, and the funds should be returned to the state. During this current audit, that amount has now grown to $23.1 million, although we now include never activated cards since the contract with the debit card bank has ended and DUI distributes benefits through a different bank via check or direct deposit. Finding 8 is very unique as it starts with an action DUI implemented to reduce potential fraud. That is, back in July of 2020, close to $500 million in benefit payments were stopped as DUI claimed they noticed an unusual volume of payments going to non-neighboring states, for example, Florida or California. And this sent up a warning flag for potential fraud. However, this stop payment was directly with the bank issuing debit card, and no entries were made for this stop payment in DUI's benefit system or Beacon. And this is problematic for legitimate claimants included in the 46,986 claimants this is applicable to, as they may receive overpayment notices even though they've never received the funds. Additionally, the lack of records in Beacon for this activity prevented us from quantifying the amount of fraud versus repayment of valid benefits. Finally, finding 9, which is very similar to findings 1 and 2 from Part 1 report, is about not performing reconciliations. However, this one relates specifically to the trust fund activity, which had not been reconciled since August 2020 as of May of 2021. The trust fund activity is not insignificant. During the period where reconciliations did not occur, disbursements exceeded $5 billion and transactions generally occurred daily. To address this finding, in addition to conducting the reconciliations, DUI will need to resolve differences between records. The remaining slides are reference to the closed session cybersecurity related findings. So this time I'd like to open for questions.
All right, questions for Mr. Murzak? We can begin with Delegate Arntz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there any way of telling the number of fraud cases myself as a delegate, when I was running through all the issues and all the hearings we've had with the secretary and pounding the department to get something done and resolve my personal problems with my constituents? Is there any way of telling how many of them were fraudulent?
The DUI does have a specific fraud investigation unit, and I believe they might have that data. Comprehensive, we don't have figures of exactly what's been identified as fraud.
I guess my point is I recall back during all this crisis, all we did was every time we had a hearing, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for sticking around this long. I don't know many people that would have put up with it as well as you did. And as we sit here in hindsight, and I recall in my committee alone, we did address a couple pieces of legislation that we quote unquote said would help. And those things were more of putting more pressure on the department to do something they weren't equipped for, manned for, or whatever to do. And I sit back and as you reflect on what you're saying here and all the problems and all the other audits we have, I just wonder what more we should have been doing as opposed to help, as opposed to sitting back saying criticizing. You know, when you try to implement something and you add staff, what, like 10 times what you currently had, you can't expect anything else but failure to try to educate, because we always sit back and talk about accountability, training and what have you. And we've had audits where we've criticized departments heads because something's fallen through the cracks. And based on all we're hearing, I just can't imagine anything not falling through the cracks. I do appreciate things went wrong. We all had a horrific time for a while, but the people that needed the most did get addressed ultimately. Sadly, a lot of people that took advantage of the system also got addressed. And I'm hoping as we move forward that the accountability for this starts to come out for the people who did defraud the system, and that we actually put something in place to make it an impact where people will not try it again. But again, I was one of the first guys to complain. I get that. I'm still a guy who rants and raves about it. But in lieu of the pressures and the scope of this whole project, I think there's a lot of places to throw blame, and I would not leave the federal government out of this. I would not leave the federal delegation out of this. I would certainly hold us somewhat accountable for not doing more to help. And I would also would have maybe looked at things a little bit differently, but I do appreciate all the effort that's gone into this. And like I said, accountability will be something, as you know, I keep pushing for. But thank you to everybody for this, because it's really enlightening. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? Mr. Merzak, maybe you can illuminate for us where LLA specifically is finding certain instances where, at least from the auditor standpoint, you believe that Beacon has not been able to provide some capability that the state ought to have. And you cite that in several references in your audit. On the other hand, the department seems to contend that Beacon has been very responsive. Perhaps you could elaborate on that from your perspective.
Okay. So one thing I actually would echo some of the secretary's comments that the vendor does seem responsive. If the agency puts a request in with the vendor from our view will address it. And that's kind of indicative in the agency responses to our audit report, where a lot of the comments are, yes, we acknowledge the problem, and we have made a request with our vendor to provide that capability, and they expect it to be resolved. We actually saw some of that with the way that the reports were split in functional areas. We saw actions taken to address Part 1 deficiencies while we were working on the benefit functional areas.
So maybe just extrapolating from what you're saying then, that what you're contending is that the vendor Beacon has been fairly responsive to requests that have been made of them to provide additional capabilities of the system.
Correct.
Right. But it seems like you've cited a few instances in this audit where there were capabilities that were deficient from Beacon. And I guess extrapolating from what you're saying then, that's because the department didn't ask Beacon to be able to initially have those capabilities until you had brought it to their attention.
Yes, and I think that's the value an audit offers. We're a set of outside eyes that come in and look for, does this function? Are the controls in place? So we should be identifying problems with systems that the agency might overlook.
Right. So it's helpful to have that extra eye, although this could also have been picked up directly by the department and requests made directly at Beacon.
Perhaps.
Right. Okay. Any further questions? Okay, we'll turn it over to the department. Secretary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take specific questions as well. I would comment on just that last point. You know, while we were overwhelmed, the staff at Sagitech working on the Beacon system were also overwhelmed and literally working around the clock. And so there were things that we may not even have thought to ask them to do. For example, every state in the nation halted their cross matches because MOUs are required. That cross match is a manual system. maybe, you know, going forward, we are all retroactively putting that in and programming it, getting MOUs in place so that it's more automated. But it was a manual process, and our staff was, as you can imagine, all hands on deck. I mean, this kind of speaks to the fraud. Everyone wanted us to pay people quickly. If we had halted claims to manually try to do cross matches with, you know, the education system and the prisons and all the other entities that we could have been doing, that would have left more customers not getting their claims processed, and it would have allowed more issues to be created, which required adjudication on the back end, which we were, you know, trying our best to get through all of that adjudication at the time. It was all hands on deck to process claims. And so it really, the supervising, the fact that, you know, one of our audit findings is on not having supervisory review of our audit adjudication determinations. Yeah, we stopped our supervisory reviews because every supervisor and every staff member was working to address issues directly with our constituents and our customers. I would thank Delegate Arentz for being really honest throughout this process of everything we've dealt with the pandemic, and with an IT background. He was sometimes critical, which I understood and appreciated, and we always had open lines of communication. I remember when we were on weekly phone calls with the General Assembly to try and I was doing my very best to answer questions along the way as we were learning and training staff on the new programs and trying to get benefits rolled out and do the very best we could to consistently block the fraud coming into our system. This was, you know, a once in 100-year crisis. We did the very best we could. And I think this audit kind of points out all the reasons that collaboratively we need to focus in a different way on fraud. This is a very different type of fraud that had never hit any unemployment insurance system in the country. It's identity fraud. And as you might know, when a claim comes into our system, as required by the federal government, if there is a name, a social security number, an address, and what am I missing? A date of birth. It gets filed in our modernized system, and Social Security Administration automatically either verifies or doesn't verify. Prior to all of our anti-fraud verification systems and algorithms in place, that was kind of the verification. If we got that back, we believed we were good to go. That is now not even close to enough to stop fraud in our system. We have to add multiple layers. That's unfortunate for our customers. And it's not going away anytime soon. So we will keep attacking, you know, every scheme that comes to us. We watch for it and learn about it on a daily basis. And it's really changed the way we do business going forward.
So I have a follow-up question on the fraud piece, because you spent a lot of time talking about the concerns with fraud, and obviously there were concerns with fraud. And you cite the fact that sometimes being able to cross-reference beneficiaries across the states can be really difficult, and MOUs need to be in place, and that's certainly understandable. That's almost as though it's kind of the next most advanced level of kind of detecting fraud across states by collaborating with them. But it seems like even in this audit, there were certain things that were very basic that could have been done to prevent fraud that weren't implemented initially. Things like monitoring for foreign IP addresses, right? That seems pretty basic. That seems like something that the department could do on their own without requiring an MOU. Or I think in the audit, it was also cited that some benefits were mailed to prisons or people that were incarcerated. Should that have raised red flags in some way sooner? Or that there were debit cards sent to addresses that were not originally in the DUI system. You know, all of those things don't require MOUs or collaboration. It seems like fairly common sense if someone would have brought it up or thought of it, that there could have been a filter or screen applied to those benefits going out, because every dollar that's going out that's fraudulent are dollars that aren't reaching folks that really need that help.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman, and most of those things we have and are doing. Remember, the audit period is during the heat of the pandemic. So this was at the very beginning of the launch of our Beacon system. One of the very first things we did, you're right, no MOU required, was block foreign IP systems. The minute that we were one of the first states in the nation to discover the foreign fraud rings hitting our system, I believe that was July of 2020 when we made that announcement. It was 4th of July weekend, I remember, because it was a busy weekend because of that discovery. For our team, we immediately blocked all foreign IP addresses. We even went further with some of our new algorithms with certain out-of-state addresses that were suspected as fraud through certain algorithms. Those were easy things that we could do that we wouldn't have been able to do without a vendor like Beacon and a modernized system. We never could have done those things easily in a legacy system. So that's a good thing. We are still working with our banking partners. One of the audit findings that was discussed related to a $23 million amount that was actually from bank cards reissued by our banking partner and not authorized by our department. The reason that money is claimed to be sitting on cards still is because those were fraudulent accounts. We found out about it. We worked with our banking partner to block those cards to make sure that money did not go out to fraudsters. We are still in the process of reconciling all of that. That money will go right back into our system. It's federal funds. But we are working with not just the legislature and the federal government, but also our banking partner that transitioned from Bank of America to Wells Fargo to make sure we could allow direct deposits, which is easier and more direct for our customers. We're working to get all of that reconciled, and we're actually proud of a lot of that money that did not get released onto debit cards to fraudsters.
Yeah, thank you. That was actually one of the questions I was going to ask about, because of the 23 million that I think the auditors cite were expired or never activated cards. Did you just cite the fact that your banking partner reissued those cards as well?
Yeah, so even our banking partners were facing new types of schemes from fraudsters during the pandemic that they had never experienced before. Bank of America and many other banking partners across the country have debit card systems for unemployment insurance state systems. And what was happening in some instances were fraudsters would file a claim. They wouldn't have the correct address. They would call the bank directly, and they would allege that they never got their card, or that money had been stolen off their card. Our contract requires that we own that money. We are required to be involved with any authorization of funds. But there was a period of time where our banking partners were facing a crisis and a pandemic as well. And sometimes the banking partners would reissue a card to a claimant that may or may not have been fraudulent. And as we discovered those, we would immediately block them so that the cards got pulled back, the money got pulled back, and no money was available to those fraudsters.
So the 23 million in expired and never activated cards, the department is currently going back through that list to determine who should rightfully receive those benefits and who should not. And those that should not, we're pulling that funding back.
No, we have pulled that 23 million back off cards, sitting on cards. We're just reconciling with Bank of America because we have determined every single one of those claims from those particular cards as fraudulent.
Okay, so the 23 million will come back to the general fund.
Yes.
Okay. I have a more generalized question, I guess, which is, I think the department was obviously in a challenging position with the pandemic, right? And when there was just an incredible amount of need, an unprecedented amount of need, there's always a need to be able to strike the right balance between those who need help and those who were trying to receive benefits that they had not earned. And that can be incredibly challenging, right? In a time that was very intense, was very anxiety provoking, was a period where many of your personnel had to move to remote work as well. Do you feel like you got that balance right? And would there have been anything that you would do in hindsight? Because it's always a tough balance to make sure that people who need the help are getting the help without closing the door too quickly and catching those folks that really should receive help and are not getting it?
Well, Mr. Chairman, that is the question of the century. You know, what would we have done differently? You're right. It was an incredibly difficult balance, and decisions had to be made that were some of the most difficult decisions in my lifetime. There were points in time where it seemed very convenient. Our vendor could have programmed the system to default pay everyone, and we could have tried to reconcile in the back end. Like I said, we know now that more than $50 billion would have gone out to fraudsters had we done that. So I'm very glad that we worked to strike the balance of maintaining the integrity of our system. During this pandemic time, we were dealing with primarily the vast majority of this funding and these benefits were federal from the new federal programs. Even since the end of the federal programs, we have seen a staggering amount of fraud. And had we not put systems in place, we have calculations that show hundreds of millions of dollars that would have gone out to fraudsters if we were just paying and reconciling after. So all of these systems were needed. Going forward in the future, the situation will not be the same because states now have experienced something like this. We have all of these fraud mechanisms in place, anti-fraud, identity verification. Striking the balance of ease of filing and ease of process for our customer is always our goal, and we will continue to look to ways to streamline. You mentioned our own staff going to remote work. In the midst of the pandemic, if we could have immediately opened up our kiosk system and allowed people to come in person to present identity documents once we discovered the fraud, that would have gone a long way. We weren't in a position yet in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and the safety of our customers and our staff to be able to do that. So it was the challenge of a lifetime. We did the very best we could, working with our vendor partners, working with all of you and your staff to try and serve customers as quickly as we possibly could. I wish that all of you could see some of the positive messages we received over that time. We know that you most often hear from claimants who have a complex issue on their claim or have been suspected for fraud, or a fraudster has hijacked their account. All of these things we were dealing with, and those are who you hear from. We thankfully, because it's kind of what kept us going, we also hear at times from customers who received excellent customer service and who were able to stay in their homes, were able to feed their families because of the customer service that we were able to provide and getting them the benefits they needed. So it's a tough balance. We believe we made the decisions that were necessary in the heat of the crisis. And going forward, we're glad to have so much more information so that in another crisis, we will be prepared to fight foreign fraudsters, and we will continue to improve our system for ease of customer service to our customers.
Thank you, Secretary Robinson. Last question then. As your tenure wraps up at the Department of Labor, and you look back in hindsight, and now hopefully with some ability to not be in kind of the height of the pandemic that we've been experiencing over the last 2.5 years, do you have any kind of closing recommendations for us as legislators? Particularly, there are a few of us who will remain with the legislature to be able to help with implementation of any improvements and suggestions, whether it's to Beacon or to our unemployment system generally, that you want to offer to us as kind of parting thoughts for us to be able to work on?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me that latitude to offer any advice I could impart. I would hope that you stay connected to the staff and the leadership of this division, who are heroes, in my opinion. And I would hope that you work with the federal delegation and Congress to follow through on what we just learned from the Deputy Secretary at USDOL, which was that states' funding for unemployment insurance programs has been cut in the past year over 20%. unacceptable. If they've seen anything, they absolutely know that our workload has increased because of fraud. It's a problem that is here to stay for years to come. And that's unfortunate for our customers. And if there were more uniform guidance, if there were more uniform ways for states to work under the federal government to fund the fighting back on these activities, it would make a world of difference. I think that our system has come so far. And like I said, we're in that period of tweaking where we can finally get around to doing the things that will just improve performance. So collaboration with your team and with our staff to continue not just to resolve claim by claim, because we know those will exist, but for recommendations on, system functionality. If there are ways that we can tweak and make things better, like I said, this program was designed over a decade that did not anticipate a pandemic or all this fraud. There are now things we believe we've done a lot, but we know there's more to do. And as the sophisticated cyber fraud continues to hit us, I have no doubt that our private sector partners and our staff and all of you will continue to find ways to improve the system so that it's balancing the ease of filing and processing for our claimants at the same time, getting to a point where we can 100% say that we're blocking fraud in our system and maintaining the integrity of the system.
Thank you, Secretary Robinson. That was very helpful and informative for us. And I want to also be clear from the committee's perspective, these questions were not meant to denigrate the hardworking staff at MDL, who I know have been through some of the most challenging circumstances, and we want to thank them for their effort to rise to the occasion as well, because it's been incredibly difficult to work through all the throes of the pandemic. And many of who are your staff who've moved to remote work and worked through incredible challenges over the last 2.5 years. So we want to thank the staff at MDL as well for all of their work.
Thank you for saying that.
And so I think that wraps up the public component, I believe, of this part of the hearing. There are some cybersecurity related findings that are redacted from the public hearing that we're going to move into closed session for. So I think we'll need to entertain a motion to move into closed session.
Mr. Chairman, motion to move to closed session under subsection 3305B15, the general provisions article, to discuss cybersecurity issues that may constitute a risk to security assessments or deployments related to information resources, technology, and network security information, and among other things.
All right, thank you, Chair Chang. I was looking for that language, and I'm glad you found it faster than I would have.
And I'll
Do we have a
second.
second? All right,
I'll
thank
second.
you. Delegate Harrison seconding. Seeing no objections, we'll move to a closed session. We will be back for those folks on the live stream. We'll be back after we wrap up the closed session.
Yes, and for those attending the meeting, you're just going to be automatically bumped into a breakout room for the closed session. Should you have any issues, please chat me on the Zoom and I'll make sure that you get over there. Okay. Chair Lamb, I think we're good to go now.
Well, thank you, June, and thank you for those of us who are still on the live stream. We just wrapped up a closed session to review some of the cybersecurity findings of the audit. Want to thank Secretary Robinson for joining us during this hearing and also representatives from the Department of Labor. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the Joint Committee, all of you, for your help through the pandemic and for allowing us to address you and answer questions today.
All right, thank you. All the best. We'll advance through the next components of the agenda. We have next an overview of the fraud investigation unit and the data analytics unit at OLA. And we'll turn over to Mr. Hook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next three presentations are customarily presented at the last JAC meeting of the year, and these will go much quicker than the last two presentations we had this morning. The first is a combined overview or update on our fraud investigation and data analytics units. There's actually two units. These units experienced some unique operational challenges this past year, and in the fiscal year 2023 budget, both units received additional resources, I'm happy to say. I believe that you have a small handout for this segment rather than a slide presentation, and the brief presentation will be made by Brian Tannen. Brian is the Audit Director of OLA's Compliance and Performance Audit Division, and that's where both of these units reside within the OLA organization. And with that, I'll turn it over to Brian Tannen, our Audit Director.
Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Brian Tannen. I am the Director of Compliance and Performance Audits at OLA. I'm here to provide an update on our fraud investigation unit, or FIU as we refer to it, and introduce you to our data analytics unit, or DAU. I'll start with the FIU. As Greg mentioned, during the past year, a significant amount of our FIU resources were redirected to our mandated audits due to staffing shortages. I'm happy to report that thanks to the legislative support during the past session, additional resources have been made available to OLA, and the FIU will be fully staffed in the near future. Despite these limited resources, FIU personnel still handled an unprecedented number of hotline calls during this past year, and we project that we will have about 1,700 calls for calendar year 2022. The increase in calls was expected and due in part to legislation championed by this committee and passed last session that required each state unit of state government to post and distribute information on our hotline, including on each state's website homepage. And in fact, we've checked, and most of those state agencies have complied, or all the state agencies that we saw have complied. Calls related to the Department of Human Services benefits, such as SNAP, TCA, and child support, things that we talked about at our last hearing, they continue to account for a significant number of the calls to our hotline and account for about 35% of the calls that were received. An additional 10% of the calls that we received related to unemployment benefits, which you just heard a lot about earlier, and tolling issues. Many of these callers were unable to get resolution to their issues before reaching out to OLA, and we were able to assist them by connecting them to the appropriate parties. Although the FIU did not issue any special reports during the past year, two reports, the State Lottery and Gaming Control Agency and the Baltimore City Community College report, had findings resulting from allegations that were received by the fraud hotline. Three other reports, the University of Maryland College Park, Maryland Department of Health, Intellectual Disabilities, Residential Centers, and the State Highway Administration, had findings that were not submitted or not initiated based on a hotline allegation, but were developed by the FIU staff utilizing their unique expertise. Finally, the FIU provided various technical assistance on 20 other audits during this past year. With that, I'll move over to the DAU. Since its inception in 2019, our data analytics unit, or DAU, has been an invaluable resource to our audit efforts. Unit is responsible for facilitating, integrating, and expanding the use of data analytics throughout OLA's audit and investigative work. I just want to point out, when I started working at OLA about 30 years ago, each audit received paper reports of all the data that we were supposed to analyze. And on some of these larger audits, we were talking about cases and cases of this big green bar paper. Since then, we've started getting more and more data in electronic format, but still need to spend extensive effort to analyze the data. The DAU has changed the entire audit process for OLA, and has integrated data analytics into all of our work. From my position as an information technology layman, and I think I'm being overly generous in my characterization, they do things that seem impossible in an efficient manner and anticipate questions or challenges that the audit crews will have. They're essentially the perfect blend of auditing knowledge and information technology. During this past year, the DAU directly assisted over 25 audits and reviews using hundreds of data sets. Now, the size of these data sets are staggering. In particular, the DAU played a major role in the unemployment insurance audit that you guys just heard about. The DAU analyzed over 300 million records across more than 60 data sets on that audit alone. This data came from a multitude of systems at several state agencies, including central payroll data, vital statistics death data, and public safety incarceration data. The DAU also provided the geo mapping of the claim submissions from foreign IP addresses that you can find in finding 2 of that report. Finally, the DAU is providing assistance for several large audits that are currently in the field and collecting, validating, and analyzing an enormous amount of tolling data in response to concern raised by the legislature regarding electronic tolling errors. I'm just going to conclude this presentation by reiterating our thanks to DLS, this committee, and the legislative leadership for their ongoing support of the FIU and the DAU over the past year. The investment in these resources will yield dividends in the years to come. This concludes my presentation. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tannen. Any questions from the committee? Okay, great. Seeing none, thank you. We appreciate your presentation for FIU and DAU.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, the next presentation is another routinely given at the December committee meeting, and it provides historical perspective, background, and current information on OLA's audit follow-up process and repeat audit findings. From OLA's perspective, the repeat finding percentage is beginning to level off with a slight drop. This presentation will be given by Christine Tamanis. Chris is an assistant director in OLA's Quality Assurance and Professional Development Division. This division provides a quality control process to ensure the overall reliability and integrity of our audit reports and compliance with professional auditing standards. The division also coordinates the office's training, recruiting, and professional development activities and oversees the administrative functions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, Senator Lamb, Delegate Chang, and committee members. OLA has various audit follow-up processes in place for repeat audit findings, and on page 2 of the presentation, we have provided an overview. Our analysis of fiscal compliance audits as of June 30th, 2022 includes the latest audit report for each agency subject to audit. Generally, every 3 to 4 years, we audit each agency. And this represents our rolling audit cycle. As of June 2022, 27% of findings were repeated in the first subsequent audit. This percentage started rising again in the past several years, with a slight reduction this year. There are 2 follow-up processes in place for repeat audit findings, as discussed on page 3. Pages 4 and 5 include some historical perspectives on the first follow-up process for agencies with 5 or more repeat findings. Page 5 shows there were 3 audit reports issued during calendar year 2021 that had 5 or more repeats. All 3 reports are subject to a quarterly status report process. Page 6 of the presentation provides background related to the JCR follow-up process. This process restricts funding for agencies with 4 or more repeat audit findings until the submission of a report by OLA on the status of the related corrective actions. As shown on page 7, the April 2021 JCR did not contain any budget language restrictions related to OLA audit findings. The April 2022 JCR contained budget bill restrictions for 3 agencies, as shown on page 8. OLA has received status reports from each agency and we will review them and report our conclusions to the budget committees. There were also budget language restrictions in April 2020 and 21 for cybersecurity related findings. In conclusion, as discussed on page 9, we believe the various follow-up processes provide useful tools to compel state agencies to take meaningful corrective action to implement audit recommendations. We've noticed some recent upticks in repeat percentages, but those percentages have begun to trend down again, as shown on page 1 of the exhibit. OLA will continue to monitor this trend and report to the committee. We can now answer any questions.
Any questions from the committee? I have one brief question. I believe there's a unit within DBM that monitors repeat audit findings of the various agencies and departments. And I think Ms. Joan Peacock had appeared before this committee, I think about a year or two ago, to provide some information in a briefing at the time. I think we had also asked for some follow-up information from their unit. Have we received that yet?
Senator, I'm not aware of having received it yet. And just to clarify, their sole task is not just repeat audit findings. It's to review significant findings in audit reports to ensure they're corrected and hence don't become repeats. It's supposed to be somewhat proactive. But I don't committee staff could answer that question, but I don't believe we've received it yet.
No, we have not received it. I think the last follow-up was in May of this year.
Okay. Could we have committee staff follow up with Ms. Peacock and her unit to see if we can receive some responses from our earlier inquiry?
Sure, of course.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Timonis.
Mr. Chairman, the final presentation is a chronological listing of the 3 audit reports issued during the period from November 1st to November 30th, 2022. The November 1st date picks up from the previous update that was provided by OLA at the November 15th, 2022 Joint Audit Committee hearing. This document also includes our recommendation for audit report hearings, which is limited to DUI Part 2, as DUI Part 1 was recommended for hearing at our last meeting. If you leaf through this very brief document, at this time, we are not recommending a letter of concern for any of the audits issued during the aforementioned short period. So it's just a very brief document that simply brings us up to date through November 30th.
Okay, questions from the committee? All right, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Hook.
Mr. Co-Chair, could I have a moment with your indulgence?
Yeah, of course.
I would like to thank all members who will be leaving the committee due to whatever reason. As I have stressed repeatedly, this committee performs a critical function, and your interest, questions, and dare I say, oversight has been much appreciated by me and the OLA. And that goes to all members and also to the members that are going to be leaving. I know there's at least 4 I think, who are leaving due to retirement or election results. And I'd like to thank them and the whole committee for your work for the period of my tenure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hook. You actually took my final point in my closing remarks, which were to really echo the same. I know many of you have served on this committee for several years. You've all made valuable contributions to this committee and have been valuable members of the Maryland General Assembly. We certainly appreciate your service, not only in this committee, but in other committees and through the general work of the body as well. And we want to thank you and wish you all the best for your service. Chairman Chang, anything you would like to add?
Just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this committee, and thanks to OLA for all the work that they've done and presented today. And thank you to all the members and also the agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Chang. Thank you to OLA and Greg and your team as well. I know all of you put in a lot of time and effort into the work that you do and are really committed to the mission, and certainly appreciate your dedication to our state. I think maybe one more hearing in January, there may not be. And so stay tuned from committee staff, whether that would occur or not. If there's not, we again want to thank everyone on the committee for your service here. With that, if there are no other comments, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Have a good holiday.
Happy holidays.